All right. Welcome back, everyone, to Lex Talk Season 3, kicking it off.
Yeah.
For all returning listeners, welcome back. And if this is your first time, get ready to explore English and linguistics in Thailand.
Yeah, it's so great to be back on LexTalk. This season, we're going to be diving into some really fascinating areas,
Yeah.
looking at how language sort of connects with culture and the way we learn, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For our first deep dive, we are going to be tackling something that's, maybe not obvious, but shapes everything that happens in a classroom.
Right.
We're talking about the invisible structure of power, authority, and status. And we're going to zoom in specifically on how language plays a role
Yeah.
in Thai classrooms,
Yeah.
particularly English, with its own unique background.
Yeah. This is so important to think about because language in the classroom isn't just about exchanging information. It subtly influences how teachers lead, how students interact with each other, and ultimately, like, the learning process itself.
Yeah. Think about it for a second. Have you ever noticed, maybe in your own school days or even now, how someone's ability to speak or their lack of ability to speak a certain language can change how people perceive them?
Yes.
That's what we're looking at today. And we're focusing in on the experience in Thailand with English language learning.
Well, the aim of this deep dive is to kind of unpack these dynamics. For anyone involved in education, really, like teachers, parents, or anyone with an interest in English language in Thailand, we've gone through some really compelling research observations to bring you guys a digestible understanding of these interactions.
So get ready. We're about to explore how language in the classroom is so much more than just words. It's, like you said, a subtle but powerful force that can shape the whole learning experience.
For sure, and getting a grasp on these dynamics is key if we want to create classrooms that are fair and as effective as they can be for all students.
All right, so let's just jump right in. Our first point is all about how language operates as a tool of power right there in the classroom. Um, let's consider this. In what ways do teachers use language to guide the classroom?
Okay, so beyond just giving direct instructions, teachers often use these sort of subtle linguistic cues or choices to kind of steer the activity in the classroom, right?
Okay, yeah,
So, for example, instead of directly telling a student what to do, a teacher might phrase something as a rhetorical question, like,
right,
shouldn't we be focusing on our work right now?
right,
And it kind of guides behavior without it being a direct command.
right.
And the way a teacher addresses students using formal titles or more informal language, that can also establish a sense of authority in the classroom,
Right,
right?
right.
And even the way feedback is given, like focusing on areas to improve versus just kind of pointing out mistakes, that can influence the dynamic.
That's really interesting. That framing of feedback, it can either give confidence to the student or make them feel less capable.
Yeah, exactly.
So what about the students themselves? How does their level of English play into how other people see them in the classroom?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. So, a student who can like express themselves fluently in English might unintentionally be seen as more intelligent or academically capable,
Hmm.
even if their understanding of other subjects is actually like on par with other students, and that's by both teachers and their peers.
Right,
And this is because English is often associated with higher levels of education and global competence, right?
right.
So this initial fluency kind of creates almost like a halo effect.
I see.
Yeah.
And that's amplified in Thailand, isn't it? Because English has that high status label here.
Yeah, yeah.
Why do you think it's seen this way?
I mean, historically and even today, English is strongly connected to access to all these international opportunities,
Mm.
success in global business,
Right.
pathways to higher education in many countries, and a vast amount of information that's available online. So, because of all of these associations, proficiency in English can be seen as a type of like social currency, right?
Right.
That fluency like opens doors that might otherwise remain closed.
Mm.
So, yeah.
And this can lead to some pretty big disparities in the classroom.
Yes.
The widening gap that we talked about.
Yeah, and a significant factor in that is the unequal access to quality English language education,
Yeah.
right? So students from more privileged socioeconomic backgrounds often benefit from having more resources, private tutoring, enrollment in language academies, even the experience of studying in international school environments.
Mhm.
And all of these advantages they quite naturally lead to stronger English language skills, right?
Right.
But on the other hand, students in public schools, particularly those in rural areas, they just might not have that same level of resources
Right.
or the same quality of instruction.
Right. So a student who has had more opportunity to learn English might be seen as more academically gifted, at least in English, when really they've just had more chances.
Exactly, yeah. And these initial perceptions, even if they're unconscious, they can really shape how teachers interact with these students,
Right.
the opportunities that they offer them, and how students themselves view their own abilities.
Right.
For example, a student who's like very comfortable speaking English, they might be like more readily chosen for leadership roles in a group project or encouraged to participate more in class discussions, not necessarily because they're more capable in that area, but just simply because of their English fluency.
I see.
And that just shows how language can inadvertently reinforce these inequalities that already exist within the classroom.
It's powerful stuff. Okay, so let's move on to our second point here. How social status specifically influences English language learning in Thai classrooms. We're going to break this down even further. We're going to start with teacher-student communication and the impact of hierarchy.
Right. And what's really interesting here is how, you know, deeply ingrained Thai cultural norms, like the high level of respect given to teachers, can shape the classroom dynamic. And while, respect is a positive cultural value, it can sometimes unintentionally create barriers to active learning.
Right.
Yeah.
How might that look in a Thai classroom? Could you give us an example?
Well, the strong emphasis on, showing respect to teachers can lead to students being hesitant to, like, ask questions
Yeah.
or seek clarification, even when they don't fully grasp a concept.
Right.
There might be a reluctance to, like, appear as if they're questioning the teacher's knowledge or their authority.
Right.
And this can be especially true in an English class where students might feel a bit more vulnerable just because of the language barrier, right?
Right.
So even if a student is struggling, they might hesitate to raise their hand because they don't want to seem disrespectful.
I see. So it's almost like that cultural value of respect, while it is good, can limit that open communication that can be so helpful in learning a language.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you had an example about correcting a teacher. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so imagine, a foreign English teacher.
Yeah.
They might occasionally, as anyone does, make a minor grammatical mistake while explaining something.
Right.
A Thai student, even if they recognize that error, they might be extremely reluctant to actually point it out.
Right.
They might fear be seen as disrespectful or kind of like undermining the teacher's authority.
Right.
And so this hesitation, although it's rooted in respect, can actually hinder the student's learning
Of course.
and the overall, accuracy of the information being shared.
Right. So it goes both ways. That's a really great example.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's turn our attention to socioeconomic status and its impact on access to English education in Thailand. We kind of touched on this earlier, but let's dive in a little bit deeper to those disparities.
Okay, so as we mentioned, the link between socioeconomic privilege and English language proficiency is quite clear in Thailand.
Right. So we often observe these, noticeable differences in the English skills of students in private schools compared to those in public schools.
Right.
And, a primary factor here is the amount of resources that are available. Private schools, they tend to invest a lot more in their English language programs, hiring native speaking teachers, providing more current materials, and just creating these richer environments.
Right.
And it's not just about like the instruction itself.
Yeah.
It extends to opportunities outside of the classroom as well. So students from wealthier families, they might have chances to travel overseas,
Right.
participate in international summer programs, have access to, private tutors, all of which, enhance their learning.
Right.
We also see that there's a geographical element here where students in urban areas generally have more access to these resources and more exposure to English compared to students in rural parts of Thailand. And, research has actually shown that students from more affluent backgrounds tend to, achieve higher scores on standardized English language tests, which is a direct link to their access to, better learning opportunities.
So that is really interesting to think about. Okay, so the third thing that we wanted to consider under this sort of like umbrella of social status is the perception of English itself as a higher status language
Yeah.
within Thai society.
And that perception is huge for English learners in Thailand.
Yeah.
So as we've discussed, English is associated with aspirations for, these international careers, professional advancement, and access to, the top educational institutions, both here in Thailand and internationally.
Right.
So, that strong link creates this pressure on Thai students to achieve like a high level of fluency,
Right.
It's almost like this unspoken understanding that if you are proficient in English, you are more capable or competent in a broader sense.
And so it's this pressure to achieve a certain level of English just to be seen as, like you said, successful or competent or whatever it may be.
Yeah, exactly.
And this can also, lead to this other phenomenon where people are really anxious about speaking English in public.
Yes, absolutely.
Even if their proficiency is really good.
Right.
It's the fear of making mistakes.
Yeah.
It's not sounding good enough to match that high status of the language.
Absolutely.
Can you give us an example of how that might manifest in real life?
Sure. So, imagine a Thai professional who actually has a solid working knowledge of English.
Okay.
But when faced with, communicating with, say, a foreign colleague or a manager, they might experience quite a high level of nervousness.
Right.
Even if their English is fine.
Yeah.
And that anxiety stems from that perceived status difference, right? Where, foreign colleague might be a native speaker.
Right.
And there's high stakes with professional communication in English.
Of course.
And then that nervousness can then affect their fluency and their confidence.
It's like a self-fulfilling cycle, right? The pressure to be perfect leads to anxiety, which then hinders their ability to communicate.
Yeah.
Okay. So considering all these factors, the inherent power of language, the influence of social status, and, the nuances of Thai culture, what strategies can teachers employ to kind of foster a more balanced and encouraging learning environment?
Yeah.
That's our third key area.
Yeah, that's the real question.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things that teachers can do.
Okay.
But I think one thing that's really important is to create more interactive and engaging English classroom environments.
Okay.
This means shifting away from traditional teacher-centered instruction.
Right.
And moving towards activities that actually promote open discussions, respectful debates among the students.
Right.
And collaboration. It's about getting them to actively use the language, not just passively receiving information.
So really prioritizing that active language use.
Yeah.
And student-to-student interaction.
Exactly. And a cornerstone of all of this is to really cultivate a classroom atmosphere where students feel safe and supported in taking those linguistic risks and making mistakes while they're learning English.
Yeah.
It's about reframing errors as a natural and valuable part of the journey, not something to be, ashamed of or penalized for.
So what teaching techniques can help create that supportive environment?
Incorporating group-based activities can be really effective.
Okay.
It gives opportunities for students to take on different roles, including leadership.
Yeah.
And to use English in this less intimidating setting
Okay.
than if they're speaking in front of the whole class, right?
Right.
So things like collaborative problem-solving tasks, role-playing, student-led presentations, but in smaller groups. And these activities not only encourage language use, but also help to distribute power and status in the classroom, which is what we're talking about.
And what about making English language learning more accessible to students, the ones who have fewer resources outside of school?
Yeah, well, this needs a multifaceted approach, right?
Okay.
So at the school level, it could involve seeking and allocating more resources to those schools that are in underserved areas.
Okay.
Particularly in the more rural areas.
Yeah.
Right? Offering free English practice sessions outside of school.
Yeah.
Maybe facilitated by, older, more proficient students or volunteers.
Right.
I mean, even leveraging technology, right?
Right.
To give students access to online learning resources and language exchange partners,
Yeah.
It can all play a role.
So it's a combination, right?
Yeah.
It's both what happens in the classroom and then working to reduce that inequality of access.
For sure.
Okay, and lastly, we talked about anxiety.
Mhm.
That's related to, English's high status in Thai society.
Right.
How can teachers address that in the classroom?
I think just explicitly addressing it with students is really important.
Okay.
Teachers can start by talking about the fact that achieving fluency, effective communication is a much more important goal than perfect grammar or pronunciation, especially at the beginning.
Okay.
And sharing examples of people who are like successful English speakers who still make mistakes
Right.
can be really reassuring, and it normalizes the experience.
Hmm.
And, like we said before, constantly normalizing those mistakes in the classroom, providing that constructive feedback, celebrating the effort
Yeah.
over perfection, I think is key.
Sure.
Research shows students learn more effectively when they feel comfortable to participate
Of course.
without that fear of judgment or ridicule.
Right.
So creating a safe space
Yeah.
is super important.
That's great advice. It's clear that, teaching English effectively is about so much more than the mechanics of the language.
Oh, absolutely.
It's about creating that environment where all the students feel encouraged to engage.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've explored how language in the classroom isn't this neutral tool. It carries power and status, particularly in the context of learning English in Thailand. We've seen how teachers' practices, the influence of those social and economic factors, and even the cultural expectations all shape this experience of learning English.
Yeah, and for anyone who's interested in English in Thailand, whether you're an educator, a parent, or just a learner yourself, it's so important to be aware of these things, right?
Yeah.
To recognize these structures that sometimes are invisible and then work towards fostering more equitable and effective learning environments.
So for you listening, have you ever felt that hesitation or anxiety when speaking English? Maybe due to social pressures or the fear of making those mistakes. We'd love to hear about it. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments section wherever you're listening to LexTalk.
As we finish up this deep dive, we wanted to give you a quick preview of what's next, right?
Okay.
Next time, we're venturing into the world of cross-cultural misunderstandings. Those common scenarios that can come up when using English across different cultures. And even more importantly, some practical tips for navigating those.
I'm excited for that one.
Yeah.
Okay, so to stay tuned for all of that, remember to follow LexTalk on all the platforms: website, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, SoundCloud, and Spotify. You can find us at LexTalk Podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
That's been great.
Looking forward to seeing you guys next time.
Absolutely. And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of LexTalk. Until next time, let's talk, let's learn, let's LexTalk.
Bye.